see so many faces today, right before break. Thanks for joining us. So today we're switching gears a little bit from the last few weeks, and today we have a very special guest talking to us from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife. So Nick Fortin is here today. He is the Deer and Moose Project leader, and so, surprise, surprise, he is here to talk about tick and moose management and some work that they're doing here in the state. And so if you have questions about the work that's being done, or maybe some interest in maybe getting involved, I encourage you to raise your hand or come down and talk after the end of our class today. So without further ado, let's welcome Nick Fortin.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming today. Again, I work for the Vermont Fish Wildlife Department. I am the Deer and Moose Project leader, which means I am responsible for everything that has to do with deer and moose management in the state of Vermont. So if anyone asks, yes, it is my fault. So I was asked to talk a little bit about how I got to this point in my career, the path I took. I don't like to talk about myself. I'm not that interesting, so I'll be fairly quick. But I grew up in Derby, Vermont, so 45 minutes away north of here on the Canadian border, in a avid outdoor family. Grew up hunting, fishing, hiking, all that stuff. Decided I wanted to pursue some sort of career in natural resources. I ended up going to Paul Smith's College in Saranac Lake, New York, for 2 years. Decided that was a little small. Finished my undergraduate degree at the University of Maine in Orono. And then I worked all kinds of jobs after finishing my bachelor's. I worked for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department as a seasonal. So we hire a bunch of temporary seasonal workers in the summer, every summer, to do a variety of different things. It changes all the time. So I did that for about 5 years, worked other little jobs in between. Eventually decided I needed to get outside of Vermont. Ended up working for the state of Maine doing Canada lynx work, which is pretty cool. Took a job out in Wyoming assessing moose and mule deer habitat, which sounds fancy, but really I got paid to hike around for 2 summers, which was awesome. And then after about a little over 5 years of doing that, I came back to New Hampshire, got my master's degree at the University of New Hampshire, studying deer. After that, it's still hard to find a job, or was, in this field. So I ended up doing some temporary work in New Hampshire, starting their moose research project, which I'll talk about ours, but helped them get theirs started. And then I actually worked out in Hell's Canyon, if any of you are familiar. It's on the border of Idaho, Oregon, Washington. I was a bighorn sheep biologist for a few years. So totally different world from here. Really liked it. I would have stayed out there for a few more years at least, but job opened up back here, and I took it to come back home, and here I am. So I guess today, the focus of this talk is about moose management in Vermont, all the science that goes into it, but specifically about the impact of winter ticks on moose. So how many people in here have seen a moose? That's pretty good. It's almost half. That's pretty good. So moose, as many of you may be aware, moose have been struggling in the Northeast in recent years. One of the major reasons for that is the impact of winter ticks. So we'll get into that more. To start, I do want to touch on some history so you kind of understand how we got to where we are today with moose and give a kind of broader perspective of what things used to be like. Put this in some context. When European settlers first arrived in New England, the landscape was almost entirely forested. Moose were common, widespread. We don't really know how abundant they were, but they were common. And they were regularly used by the indigenous people that lived here, still live here, for food and fiber, right? They use their hides and they use them for food primarily. As European settlers arrived, we began to clear the forest. So we were eliminating moose habitat. And of course, moose are a giant walking source of red meat. Settlers are hungry. Moose were shot on sight for food, primarily. And so that, and then eventually by the 1800s, Vermont was about 80% cleared of forest. Today we're the opposite, we're about 80% forested. So most of our moose habitat was gone, and again, moose were pretty much, there was no protection for them. So through unregulated hunting, moose were actually extirpated from Vermont. So there were no moose in Vermont probably by about the early 1800s, 1830s or so. And they didn't really come back until the mid-1900s as farms got abandoned and forests started to regrow. So there was better habitat and moose were protected now from unregulated hunting. So the population began to come back around the mid-1900s. I think our first estimate of moose numbers in Vermont in the 1900s was in the 1960s, I'm going to say 1965, and the estimate was 25 moose in the entire state of Vermont. Most of those would have been up in northeastern Vermont. What really helped moose come back was an outbreak of spruce budworm that happened across the region, across eastern Canada, across New England. And spruce budworm's a parasite that kills trees. It's actually misnamed. It primarily affects balsam fir, not spruce, but it will kill most balsam fir trees. And this led, while this does one thing, I mean, it kills a lot of trees, which can help regenerate forests. It primarily led to some large-scale salvage logging. So these large forest landowners wanted to salvage all those trees before they died. And so there was some massive logging that happened. This era actually led to a lot of the heavy cutting laws that exist today because of the scale of the clear cutting that happened. But in the Northeast, when we cut forests, they grow back really well on their own, really, really thick. And that creates a lot of food for moose. So all of this logging created phenomenal moose habitat. And our moose population took off. So this is a chart of road-killed moose, which we track every year. We know how many moose are killed by collisions with motor vehicles every year since 1980. So in 1980, there were zero, and there had never been one, at least in modern times, before that. 1981 was our first one road-killed moose. And by about 2000, we were averaging about 150 a year. So the population just took off. With the return of moose came all of the benefits that come with having moose. We reinstituted a moose hunt in the early 1990s. So moose were providing a lot of food for people who were lucky enough to get a permit. There was a new and unique wildlife viewing opportunity, photographers, and all sorts of other kind of weird habits people have or interests people have, like going out and looking for moose antlers. But there's a lot of value to having moose on the landscape. But the chart I showed you was moose getting hit by cars, right? Which is a problem, because when people hit moose with a vehicle, it tends to come through the windshield. Moose are tall, they're very large. You tend to just take the legs out and the moose comes through the windshield. So there have actually been 14 human fatalities since 1980. And having, pushing 200 moose vehicle collisions a year is a significant public safety concern. And so that was an issue. In addition to that, moose were causing some pretty serious damage to their habitat. So this is a stand of mountain ash, which is a really important tree. It tends to grow at higher elevations. Really important food source for a lot of wildlife It produces berries, pretty big berry crop. Moose love it. A lot of animals love it, but moose really love it. They will strip all the bark off of it to eat the bark. Moose in Algonquin, or it's roughly translated from Algonquin, but it means either twig eater or bark eater, depending how you translate it. So moose will strip all the bark off these trees, and of course that kills the tree. So that's a problem, but more so, they just weren't letting forests regenerate in some areas. So this is an area that had been logged about 15 years prior, and working with the Department of Forests and Parks, we actually put up this is in East Haven, for anyone who knows the area near the radar base in East Haven. We actually put up this exclosure. So this is designed to keep moose out and see the difference. You know, they can't browse on those trees inside the exclosure. They can browse outside. And so you can see outside, it doesn't look like there are any trees there. There actually are trees there. They all look like the little bonsai thing in the inset photo. And they're all held about 3 feet tall, which is about the depth of the snow in the winter. So if they're under the snow, they're protected. The trees in the exclosure are about 12 to 15 feet tall because the moose aren't eating them. So significant damage to the forest health, serious threat to human health, most motor vehicle collisions. And that forest health or forest impacts also started to impact the health of moose. So in a healthy moose population, an adult female moose will give birth every year to at least one calf, and about 25% of the time she'll give birth to twins. So what we were seeing in our reproductive rate was this decline. So this is ovulation rate, and I'll show this chart filled in a few times. So this is ovulation rate. We actually get this when if a hunter takes a female moose, they are now required, it wasn't always required, but they are now required to provide the ovaries. So they have to remove the ovaries from that female moose and bring them into us. We can see how many eggs that cow released, so it tells us how many calves she would have had the following spring. So it gives us a measure of reproductive rate. So there's a lot of noise here, but there was a substantial, significant trend downward from well above 1.25 down to about 1, which means what was happening, we weren't seeing twins anymore. That tells us our moose were not very healthy. We knew the forests weren't very healthy. That made sense. So the decision was made to attempt to reduce the number of moose, particularly in northeastern Vermont. This is the number of permits issued for moose hunting. So I mentioned we started moose hunting. Our first season was in 1993, first modern season. We issued 30 moose hunting permits. So moose hunting permits are issued by lottery. We set the number of permits. Hunters have to apply to a lottery, and maybe they get drawn. Today, we issue about 100 permits, and there are 7,000 hunters that apply for those 100 permits. So your chance of getting one is pretty slim. It's pretty much a once-in-a-lifetime deal now. But anyway, over time, that number of permits had crept up as the moose population had increased. And the intent there was not so much to try to catch up with the moose population, but just there were more moose, so we figured, hey, I say we, this was before I was a child then, but it was just, we can provide more opportunity. There are more moose out there, we can issue more permits, it's not gonna have an impact. We were expanding the hunt to other parts of the state, so the number of permits was increasing slowly, but it really wasn't doing anything to impact the moose population. So when the department decided, hey, we're gonna try to reduce moose numbers, we issued a lot of permits, over 1,000 for 5 years in a row, to really attempt to knock moose numbers down. And about half of those permits were for what we call antlerless moose, but essentially trying to target female moose to really, those are the ones that control the population, right? One male moose can breed with multiple females, but if you remove a female, there's no calves produced the following year. So we really brought that population down. We reduced permit numbers, and in theory, based on what we knew at the time, we should have been able to maintain about 400 permits. That should have allowed the population to stay stable. We should have seen, forest health improve, moose health improve, all that fun stuff. So this is, again, roadkill in the orange. The green line is our actual population estimate, which we've had since 2000. You can see we brought the population down. And then, I'm not sure if this works very well, but right about 2010, 11, that was the last year of high permit numbers. So that's when permit numbers really dropped. The population should have leveled off after that, because hunting was not significant enough to cause a decline, we thought. But it didn't. The population continued to slide. We were seeing improvements in forest health, right? The moose weren't over-browsing the forest anymore. Population was declining. And equally, well, here's the permit numbers. You can see we actually kept dropping permit numbers because the population kept dropping down to the very low numbers we have today. There were a few years there with none, but that was more to change rules than because we shouldn't have had permits. Anyway, we kept dropping permit numbers very low, and it still didn't matter. The population kept dropping. And the health did not improve. So this is the one that scared us the most. Despite there being plenty of food out there for them and fewer moose on the landscape, the health of these moose just continued to slide, continued to go downward. We're like, well, what is going on here? Right. Why is this happening? This doesn't make sense to us. And there are three reasons. One is, of course, the focus of this conversation today, but two other ones that affect moose in most of Vermont, are probably bigger factors in most of Vermont, are brainworm and habitat. And then, of course, winter tick, which is the big driver, but really only affects moose in a small part of Vermont. So I'm going to touch on these other two, brainworm and habitat, real quick, but then the rest of this is going to focus on winter tick. So brainworm, as the name implies, don't try to even begin to pronounce the scientific name, Parelophostrondylus tenuis. But it is a worm that lives in the brain, right? It is a nematode roundworm that lives in the meninges, so the lining around the brain, usually of a white-tailed deer. So in its normal life cycle, brainworm lives in white-tailed deer, and then it actually has an intermediate host that is a gastropod, so a snail or a slug. So that gastropod picks up larval worms from deer feces, and then the deer has to inadvertently eat that snail or slug while it's feeding on vegetation to get that cycle going, continue that cycle. If a moose accidentally eats that infected snail or slug, it becomes infected with brainworm, and because moose did not evolve with brainworm like deer did, they don't have the right immune response, the worm doesn't get the right signals, and so moose get more inflammation. The worm doesn't get the right signals from the moose, so it tends not to stay in the meninges. It tends to actually burrow through the spinal cord and through the brain itself. That, of course, is not good. That leads to neurological disease and usually, eventually, death of the moose. So, as you might imagine, areas with more deer tend to have a higher incidence of brainworm. And so this map is the best we have of deer numbers across the Northeast, or the three northern New England states. This is deer harvest, where each dot represents one deer killed by a hunter. But you can tell the areas, the darker green areas have a lot more deer. The lighter, whiter areas have few deer. Generally speaking, the dark green areas have enough deer where brainworm is prevalent enough where we would expect it to cause a decline in the moose population. So anywhere that's dark green on this map, moose are going to struggle just because essentially competing germ warfare with deer, which they lose. The other really important factor for moose, and I hinted at this earlier, is habitat. So when we're talking about habitat for moose, it's that young forest habitat, food, right? Moose eat, they're browsers, which means they almost exclusively, eat the leaves and twigs of woody plants. So they need a lot of that stuff within reach, right? Within, 6-8 feet of the ground, maybe. Young forest habitat provides that. Sometimes this is called early successional habitat. in most of Vermont, we have seen a significant decline in the amount of young forest habitat to the point where we now have less young forest habitat than what researchers believe was here when European settlers first arrived. So very, very little, and that gets back to that land use history that we started with. When all of those farms were abandoned in the late early 1900s, all happened within a couple decades. So almost all of our forests are about the same age. They are, by forest standards, middle-aged. They're not old yet. They're not old enough where trees are dying of old age and falling over and where we're starting to, see new trees grow up. They're all kind of the same middle-aged pole stand. So picture's worth a lot more than me explaining it. The one on the left here is young forest habitat. Lots of food, lots of cover. The forest on the right is what most of Vermont looks like, right? Fun for people to recreate in. You can see, you can walk through it real easy. But for a lot of species of wildlife, moose included, that might as well be a desert. There's no food. There's really no cover. They don't feel secure in there. And so you're just not going to support many animals in that type of habitat. The one exception to this is northeastern Vermont, and I mean far northeastern Vermont, where most of the land is commercial timberland. These large companies own it for the purpose of growing and cutting trees. And so logging is intensive and extensive. There's a lot of it that goes on, and it creates phenomenal moose habitat. And so as a result of that, we have far more moose in northeastern Vermont than elsewhere. So this is based on our current population estimates by wildlife management unit. So that's what each of these kind of areas is that's the unit we manage our game animals at. You can see how many more moose. Each dot represents one estimated moose on this map. Obviously, we don't know exactly where they are. It's just randomly within the W. But you can see how many more moose there are up in the far northeastern part of the state, what we call Wildlife Management Unit E. As this works out, that's about half of our moose that are way up there in 7% of the state. So there are as many moose in that 7% of Vermont as there are in the rest of Vermont combined. That is where winter ticks are a problem because of that density of moose. And that is also why we get a lot of people that live in some other part of Vermont that are like, oh, I've been here for 10 years and I've never seen a moose. Well, great, there aren't a lot of moose there. That means nothing. Most of our moose are found way up in the northeast corner of the state. And that area is really an extension of a much larger area in New England, in northern New England, that extends through northern New Hampshire, western and northern Maine, that we, as moose managers, consider core moose range within the region. So just like Vermont, the vast majority of the region's moose live in that core moose range. There are moose in the rest of New England, fewer and fewer as you go south. But the vast majority, well over 50%, live in that core area. So when you hear about things that might be affecting moose numbers regionally, it's probably whatever is happening in that core area, because a little blip in that core area will wipe out whatever's going on, will overwhelm whatever's going on outside. There just aren't that many moose there. As I mentioned, that brings us to the winter tick. So that core area is the only place where winter ticks are a significant problem for moose. You can find winter ticks on moose anywhere in New England, but they only reach problematic levels where there are a lot of moose, which is in that core area. So the winter tick, does anybody know how many species of tick there are in Vermont? I don't want to guess.
2, 3.
There are 15 species of tick in Vermont. There are only 2 that you are likely to ever encounter. Those are the black-legged tick or deer tick. It's probably the most likely to encounter. Or people just call it dog tick, but the American dog tick, which actually looks similar to a moose tick when it's not engorged. But those are the ones that you or your pets are likely to encounter. Unless you are handling dead moose in winter or spring, you will never encounter a winter tick. Just won't happen. They really specialize in moose. But unlike deer ticks and dog ticks, which have been kind of expanding their range northward with climate change, winter ticks have been here as long as we can tell. As long as we've had moose, we've been detecting winter ticks on those moose. We documented winter ticks killing a moose in the early 90s. So they've been around a long time. They're not new. This isn't a new phenomenon. At least them being here is not a new phenomenon. But they are benefiting from climate change. Winter ticks are often called moose ticks because they do specialize in moose. We'll get into more of that. I guess before I get into this, I should say that, again, we've known about winter ticks for a long time. But in our, so historically, and all the research that had been done on them, say into the early 2000s, said, you know, they exist on moose. Yeah, they might occasionally kill one. Every now and then, you get an explosion of winter ticks and you see a moose die off for like a year. And then it doesn't happen again for a long, long time. And so when we wrote, again, this is before my time, but when the department wrote our, so we do 10-year big game management plans. So all of our big game species, moose, deer, black bear, turkey is a big game for some reason. We do a 10-year plan for those species. They're in like nice decadal increments. So when we drafted our 2010 to 2020 big game plan, which was written before I worked for the department, but 2008, 2009 is probably when that was drafted, winter ticks were barely mentioned, right? They were like, oh yeah, these exist, like maybe we should watch for them, but not a management concern, not really anything we thought of that we should be paying attention to or certainly doing research on. That plan was for 2010 to 2020. By the middle of that, by 5 years into that plan, winter ticks were the only thing we were talking about. That's all that mattered in the moose world. And by 2017, we'd started this massive research project to try to understand the impact of winter ticks. So things can change really quickly, I guess is the point to make there. But so to understand what impact winter ticks were having on our moose and understand how should we be managing for this, we worked with the University of Vermont on this fairly large moose collaring study. So we captured and put GPS radio collars on 126 moose, 36 cows, 90 calves. What we tried to do is always have 30 collared cows so we could monitor reproduction and survival of calves or newborn calves. And then we collared 30 calves every January. So those are like 7 or 8 month old calves in January. And we wanted to track their survival through the winter and spring because we knew that was the age group most impacted by winter ticks. So we did this. We partnered with the UVM, like I said. Several graduate students got their degrees on this project. And we worked with native range capture services to do all the capturing. The capturing is pretty ridiculous. So all of these moose were captured from a helicopter using a net gun. So, you know, this is very remote country. For any of you who have spent time in far northeastern Vermont, there aren't roads. There's really no access to these areas. So with snow on the ground, these crews would fly around in a helicopter with the doors off in January, because they're crazy. And the real crazy one would lean out of the helicopter. I mean, he's tethered in, but lean out with a net gun. So this is a gun that shoots a net. And they would dive bomb a moose, get about 15 feet above it, which probably scared the ever-loving crap out of that moose. But and they would shoot the net, the moose would tangle up. And then two guys would jump out, tackle that moose, take the net off it, blindfold it, hobble it, put a collar on it, count ticks, take a blood sample, took a couple other samples, put ear tags in it. And for calves, they weighed it So they actually brought the helicopter back in, picked it up, got a weight, put it back down, and they did all of that in about 10 minutes. It sounds crazy, but that is actually far less stressful on the moose, far safer for the moose than trying to tranquilize it. Tranquilizers don't work like the movies. They take several minutes to kick in. A moose in several minutes can run a really long ways and get somewhere you could never get to it. More importantly, you're trying to shoot a dart at an animal that is running while you're flying in a helicopter. You cannot hit what you're aiming at. And a dart is a bullet. So if you don't hit what you're aiming at, you probably kill the moose. So this is a far safer way, and these guys are incredibly good at it. They had a couple days where they captured 20 moose in a day. So the collars that we put on these animals are GPS collars with satellite transmission. So I can sit in my office and this collar sends us a GPS location every 13 hours. Some of them are still working, which is more impressive. It's supposed to send one every 13 hours. In reality, it doesn't get a fix every time, but nonetheless, so we don't actually have to be out there tracking these moose all the time. The most important feature of them, though, is they have a mortality sensor. So if the collar does not move, meaning even like a little head shake or something, but if the collar does not move for 6 hours, we all get emails and text messages that say moose number whatever is dead. And so it allowed us to, I say us, really the graduate students at UVM had to deal with this, but allowed them to get out there as quickly as possible when those animals died. And in most cases, we could get to it within 24 hours. That allowed us to perform a necropsy. Necropsy is an autopsy on an animal. Examination of that moose, collect a bunch of samples, and send those off to a lab, and that's how we could really determine how the moose died. Now, objectively, I hope none of you ever have to see it, but if you walk up to a moose that died from winter ticks, you know how it died. There's no question when there are 30,000 ticks on the animal, right? But science, we have to actually prove that that was the cause of death. This moose is still alive, number 22. So we were part of, we started our study in 2017. We were really joining ongoing studies in Maine and New Hampshire and Maine, doing the exact same thing. So essentially we have 4 study areas in 3 states looking at doing the exact same, kind of repeating the same study, which gave us a range of moose densities. I mean, we have high density moose. Northern Maine has really high density moose. And a range of climate. So like winters are longer in northern Maine than they are in northern New Hampshire, northern Vermont. So we can see kind of those different impacts of moose density and climate on winter ticks. New Hampshire and Maine started a little before us. Collectively we have, well, Maine is still going in some places, but collectively we ended up with 6 years of monitoring across the 3 states. In 5 of those 6 years, at least 50% of the calves died. So we call that an epizootic when that happens, when we reach that threshold. So in 5 of 6 years, we lost 50% of the calves regionally. In Maine and New Hampshire, some years it was 75 to 80%. So kind of unprecedented parasite impact. So here in Vermont, in our 3 years, what we saw is that 87% of our adult cows survived each year, which is pretty normal in a wild moose population with no major predators, right? We don't have wolves. Bears don't kill moose, certainly not adult moose. So about 87% of our adults survived, and actually with a few more years of data after the study concluded, we're at about 90% now. So pretty, really normal. It's exactly what you'd expect. What was concerning is that only 57% gave birth in any given year. So on average across those 3 years, 57% would give birth per year. That should be 75, 80% of your cows giving birth. You know, some are young and you wouldn't expect them to give birth in a given year, but most of them should. Also concerning those newborn calves, which we monitored, so we would walk in on cows 2 to 3 times a week from May through August to determine when they had a calf and whether that calf survived, right, and how long it survived. So we had very skilled techs doing this work. It takes a lot of skill to sneak up on a moose, particularly a cow with a calf. It's very wary. Moose are not the stupid, cow that stands there and lets you walk up to it. They're incredibly wary animals, especially when they have a calf. So this is very difficult work, but very important data. So yeah, kind of poor survival of our newborn calves. And we don't know how they died, right? They just disappear. You see a calf, you go back 3 days later, and that cow doesn't have a calf anymore. You don't know what happened, but most of those deaths happened in the first couple weeks after that calf was born, which tells us it was some version of malnourishment of either the calf or the cow. A common thing with moose, which you don't often see in other animals, you can, but is less common. If a calf is born too small, so think about the primary impact of winter ticks happens in April, and I'll touch on the life cycle in a bit here. Moose give birth in May. So in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, they're dealing with the greatest strain from winter ticks. So it's very likely the calves are born underweight. And a moose calf that is born too small can actually die because it cannot reach the udder to nurse. Because a moose is tall, right? The udder is 4 feet off the ground. So if a calf is born too small, they cannot survive. And then those calves that we collared in January, when they're 7 or 8 months old, again, on average, 49% of those survived to May. So on average, we're losing half of our calves. And that's only the calves that make it to January. We're not making it to their first birthday. Collectively, if you kind of work all this out, a cow moose has to live for 7 years to replace herself, to raise one calf that will actually survive to adulthood. That's not great for a population. So the reason winter ticks are such a problem for moose has to do with this life cycle, the life cycle of winter ticks. So most ticks, in fact, I think winter ticks are the only one-host tick in Vermont. Most ticks, the ones you're familiar with, the deer ticks and dog ticks, the reason we're so scared of ticks, right, is because they spread diseases, right? I mean, otherwise a tick's just a bug that bites you. Maybe takes blood, which is gross, but it's the diseases that scare us. The reason ticks spread disease is because they feed on multiple hosts in their 3 life cycles. So every tick has 3 life phases: larva, nymph, adult. A deer tick, for example, as a larva, a very tiny larva, probably feeds on like a mouse or a chipmunk or something like that. That's likely where it picks up Lyme disease or anaplasmosis. And then it drops off, molts into a nymph, finds another animal, takes a blood meal, drops off, molts into an adult. Then it probably feeds on a deer or you or your pet as an adult. Because it feeds on multiple hosts, it picks up diseases and transmits them to other animals. Winter ticks are a one-host tick. So they complete all 3 life phases on the same animal, same individual animal. So in the case of winter tick, they're getting on animals right now. Moose are picking up winter ticks right now. And they'll be on a moose all winter long, 5-6 months, before they drop off in the spring to lay their eggs, start that cycle all over again. The reason moose are the only animal winter ticks thrive on is because every other animal, mammal at least, grooms itself. This tick has to spend 5 months on one animal, a deer, a coyote, anything else that grooms itself regularly is going to remove most of those ticks. In fact, in order to extend their life cycle this long, they have to go through what's called a diapause phase. So they're essentially hibernating for a couple months. So they're just on the moose, not really attached, just there, loose in the hair for several months. If an animal groomed itself, they'd knock most of those off. And it's winter, so they fall in snow and they die. Moose don't groom. They didn't evolve with external parasites, so they have no grooming, no innate grooming response. They only start grooming once there's something irritating them, which is late in the game, too late in the game, and doesn't matter. So moose can pick up tens of thousands of winter ticks. And the reason they pick up tens of thousands of winter ticks is not because there's so many winter ticks out on the landscape, like, oh, if you walk through moose country, you're just going to be picking up ticks left and right. It's because when you pick up winter ticks, you pick them up by the thousand. So this is a typical questing cluster of winter ticks, larvae. Normal cluster size is 500 to maybe 3,000 larvae. So they're not picking them up one or two at a time. They pick up 1,000. And then they go a couple days and they pick up 1,000 more. So they add up pretty quickly. And like I said, that's happening now, which is also the peak of the breeding season for moose. So they're moving around a lot more than they do any other time of year, which means they're picking up more ticks. So all of this does not work out well for moose. The reason moose density is important, I mentioned the only places winter ticks are a problem is where we have a lot of moose. The reason density is important is because you need a lot of moose to get winter ticks up to that level. If you don't have many moose, they just can't. So winter ticks aren't out, like they can't chase after a moose, right? They're born here, they climb up the nearest piece of vegetation and they wait for something to walk by. If nothing walks by, they failed. They die when the snow comes, and that's it. So if there are more moose on the landscape, the odds of a moose or something else, but really they want to be on a moose, right? Another animal's going to groom them off. So if there are more moose on the landscape, the odds of a moose walking by that cluster and picking them up is much higher. So you have more moose, they pick up more of the clusters that are waiting out there, and then collectively, of course, you've picked up more ticks because every moose picks up the same, roughly the same number of ticks. You have more moose, so collectively you've picked up more ticks, which means then in the spring, there are more ticks dropping off on the ground to start that cycle all over again. Each female tick is laying thousands of eggs, so you can see how that spirals. If you have fewer moose on the landscape, more of those clusters are not going to be picked up. So even if you start with the same amount of ticks, their chance of getting picked up is lower. And equally important, they will collectively pick up fewer ticks. Just because there aren't as many moose doesn't mean the remaining moose are going to go pick up the rest of those ticks that the other ones missed. So you have fewer ticks dropping off in the spring. If you played this out more years, there would be fewer ticks questing in the fall, and so on. Eventually, you end up with very low numbers of winter tick. And that's what we see in most of Vermont. There just aren't very many moose, and so moose have winter ticks on them. Most moose will have some, but not problematic levels. You got to remember, moose are huge. 2,000-3,000 ticks on a moose, not a problem. And so a lot of times we'll see, whether it's a road-killed moose or someone finds a dead moose in central or southern Vermont, and they'll be like, oh, this thing is covered in ticks. Well, yeah, that's a lot of ticks, right? 1,000 ticks on an animal is a lot of ticks. But that's not a problem. Tens of thousands is just, unless you've seen it, it's disturbing. But you understand why it kills the animal. As I mentioned, the only place we have problems with winter ticks is in this core range. The rest of New England, winter ticks actually exist all the way down to Texas. They can actually do their whole life cycle in about a month when they don't have to deal with winter. They don't have to worry about winter. But here in areas that have winter, they have that prolonged life cycle, but they really need a lot of moose to do well. I do want to emphasize, so you'll often hear us, and I've tried to leave it out of this presentation, I try not to use it anymore, but our department will often say our goal is 1 moose per square mile. Or if we get to 1 moose per square mile, we won't see winter tick impacts anymore. The reason I don't like saying that is because 1 moose per square mile sounds like very few moose, right? But 1 moose per square mile is actually, as moose go, a very high density of moose. So this is moose densities across the range of moose. And this was a different map from the same paper published a couple years ago. The reason I want this one is because on this map, the red areas, this is in moose per square kilometer, but the red areas are 1 per square mile or greater. So there's not a lot of red on this map. Those are the only places in North America where moose exist at 1 moose per square mile or greater density. It is not common. You probably would never have guessed this if I asked you where are the highest densities of moose in North America. You'd have probably said Alaska, somewhere in Canada. Northern Maine has the highest densities of moose in North America. We used to be right there with them. We've backed down some, but 1 moose per square mile is a very high density of moose. It doesn't sound like a high number. So I try not to use it anymore. But we need to recognize that as moose go, they're used to existing at very low densities across the landscape. The densities we currently have for moose are high. So where do we go with this information? Okay, we know ticks are causing a serious problem for our moose. What do we do about it, right? Our goal, our charge as a state agency is to manage for a healthy and sustainable moose population. Obviously, winter ticks are kind of fighting us on that. So how do we get to that goal of having healthy moose? Right? We don't want these sickly, skinny little moose that struggle to produce calves every year. Those calves are undersized and can't survive the winter with the tick impacts. You can see this moose is wearing a collar, and you can see how loose her collar is. We sized that for what an adult cow should be. And I don't know how it didn't fall off her head, but it didn't. She died a year after this. And we don't want half of our calves to die every year, right? We need to do something about this. Winter ticks are obviously a problem now, but our bigger concern is just the general poor health of the moose that results from it. If our moose aren't healthy, they're not going to be able to sustain whatever the next stressor is that comes along. Right? Remember I said, it's almost 15 years ago now, but 10, 15 years ago, we weren't really worried about winter ticks. And now it's our whole world. There might be something else that comes along in 10 years. And if our moose aren't healthy, they're not going to be around long after that. So we got to get them healthy. And had to throw this slide in because I know some of you are thinking it, and I know someone's going to ask it. We cannot control winter ticks directly. We can't treat moose, can't treat the landscape. We are actually working with UVM on research into a fungal pathogen that can potentially control ticks. It is so far from being viable in the field that it probably won't happen in my lifetime. There is no viable way to do it, and I don't have time, in the interest of everyone's time, I'm not going to get into why all of these would not be effective. The overarching key part of it is none of these would address the key issue, which is moose abundance, right? We can treat ticks all we want if we had some magic thing that could do it, and we could treat and get rid of most of the ticks. Nothing is perfect and gets rid of all of them. That would be great until we stopped treating or ticks became immune to the treatment, which would happen, at which point we still have abundant moose. Ticks are just going to come back. As long as we have the abundant moose population, winter ticks are just going to come back. So we know we have to deal with the moose abundance side of this equation. That is politically challenging because everyone's seen news and heard that moose are struggling and they're declining, and so telling people, well, we're going to reduce the population more doesn't really sit that well. But at least in this corner of the state, that's what we need to do. And so I do want to end on a little bit of I'm not going to call it a high note, but at least not doom and gloom. This is our full ovulation rate data set all the way to last year. We have seen no improvement. Moose are still in poor condition, but we are seeing some promising signs. So this is the number of calves recruited through the summer by our collared cows, which we still have. We monitored 20 this year. So some of them are still working. They're probably this might be the last year. Collars are about to die. Nothing statistically significant. I do have to throw that out there, but it does appear to be a bit of an upward trend here. That's promising. We look at tick counts on harvested moose. So every moose that comes in, the hunters bring in, we actually count ticks on. These are not complete tick counts. We count 4 tiny little areas on the moose to get to this number, average number. But again, a generally downward trend here. That's encouraging. Hopefully it continues to trend downward. And if we look at our moose population estimate in Wildlife Management Unit E, so this is only that corner of Vermont where most of our moose are, we see it was really high. It came down because we knocked it down with high permit numbers. And for the past 10 years, it's actually been relatively stable. You know, there's some fluctuation in our estimate, but we think in hindsight, our population's actually roughly stable now. Now, it should have grown with the limited hunting we've had and with the amount of habitat out there, but nonetheless, moose are not currently declining. So we're in a better place than what a lot of recent media on moose would suggest. So that's where we are. We want to be at about 1 moose per square mile. So it's just nudging our current population down a little bit and holding it there and hoping that we continue to see improvement in our health measures as we go forward. Hopefully it works. So with that, I will take any questions that anyone has.
So when you do a lottery moose permit, that is for the whole state, right? So you're not telling people just to go to the Northeast Kingdom and really concentrate on the overpopulated?
It is only for that Northeast corner state.
Do you think it would be helpful to have like a lottery designated for one certain spot if you're trying to reduce that?
So it is. So the permits are, all of the moose hunting permits are only for that. Yeah, so they're only for that zone. That's the only place you can hunt moose in Vermont. Okay. So in most of, and that's another confusion of people is we say we're hunting moose and you're like, oh, I haven't seen a moose in 10 years. Well, we're not hunting moose in most of Vermont because, yeah, we don't have very many and hunting is not appropriate there given our goal. But
are they doing the same thing in Maine as well?
Yeah, Maine and New Hampshire have moose hunts. Theirs are more widespread. I mean, Maine has a ton of moose. Maine has started an area where because they're big and they have a lot of moose everywhere, they can do the experimental approach and take one management unit and try to reduce moose numbers only there and see if it makes a difference. Unfortunately, we only have one unit that has a lot of moose, so we don't have that luxury. But Maine is trying to do that in one of their units. They're trying to reduce moose numbers. But for them, they're starting at 6, maybe 8 moose per square mile, and their concern is they can't get enough hunters into those areas because it's remote and they're giving out 500, 700 permits and it's probably still not enough. So it's tough. Yeah.
Does anyone ever consider introducing like a predator into the mix? Like a wolf? Maybe?
So in most of moose range, wolves are the primary predator of moose. In fact, pretty much everywhere north of the St. Lawrence, which is why you didn't see a lot of red in those areas. It would help, but that's a whole other mess of stuff we'd have to deal with to bring wolves in. Our department is never going to support bringing wolves in because of the politics. If they came here on their own, that'd be awesome. But we're never going to bring them in. The short answer is it would help. We'd have never gotten to these high densities. They'd have kept moose at an appropriate level, and we'd have probably never had this problem. our tool, the tool we have now is hunting. So humans are the predator now, and we have to do it.
Yeah.
So earlier in your talk, you said that 87% of the female moose were surviving. Does that mean that the 13% that died were all dying of winter ticks, or close to that?
That's actually a good question. So for the adult moose, so determining cause of death gets complicated. They all had heavy winter tick loads. A lot of them, the cause of death, the immediate cause of death was something else like brainworm, or some of them had significant lungworm infections. Some of them were just old. We had some that were 15 years old. So I want to say ticks were the cause of death in maybe half of those adults. But they all had heavy tick loads. So it's sort of the like, if you're already sick and now you add the ticks to it, maybe you wouldn't have died otherwise, but now you did.
My question is about the male moose population, because I know like a lot of this research is about female population. I know like as like moose hunter, like you gotta do the ovaries, you gotta do it all, but like with male moose population and the amount of like tags being like the raffles being busy from 100 to 150, like how's the male moose population in Vermont handling the winter ticks and all like all the other like what crappy fucking environment we have for them, like how are they doing?
So we didn't collar. Well, we collared male moose as calves if they happen to survive. We obviously they're not reproducing, like they're not giving birth. So we were only monitoring them if they happen to die. Generally speaking, once they reach adulthood, males do pretty well because they're so much bigger. They don't die from winter ticks, but they are debilitated. So like over time, we've seen antler size and body weights decline in males, and that's probably more due to winter ticks than anything else. Doesn't kill them, but it sets them back. As far as hunting permits go, all of our permits are for either sex. I mean, obviously hunters prefer to shoot a bull if they can. I lied. Of our 100 permits, 60 are for either sex, 40 are for antlerless only. And so the reason we did that was so we get an even harvest. So we're shooting just as many cow moose as we are bull moose. Because we didn't want to put too much pressure on our bull population. And if we just let hunters go choose, they'd shoot mostly bulls, and that wouldn't achieve our goal. So that's kind of the way we
So, you captured them with the net gun and then you put the collar on them. What else did you measure?
So when they were captured, obviously they put the collar and the ear tags on them. We took blood, which was used for a variety of things. We counted ticks. Again, just a couple sample areas. I think they did the rump and the shoulder. So we had an idea of, do the moose with more ticks on them die, or, we could make that sort of correlation. I think they took fecal samples from the moose. And that might have been it. I think the blood got used for a bunch of stuff. So we used blood for determined pregnancy in adults. They did a CBC, complete blood count, which is like kind of general broad health assessment sort of thing, and a few other things with the blood. So mostly blood was the biggest thing. Okay. Any other questions?
What was your undergraduate major?
My undergraduate major was wildlife ecology.
Okay.
Cool.
You mentioned how you did 4 different studies in 3 different states and to see if like the range of climate had affected it any. Did you find that it affected it like in a positive way or a negative way?
Yeah, so I didn't get in this, but I'm glad you asked this. So there's sort of this narrow band of space where the winters are short enough for winter. So given like winter tick's life cycle, on this end, on the fall end, they're questing the time they have to get on moose. As soon as it snows, or at least it snow that lasts a couple days, that's it. That kills all the larvae and ends it. And then in the spring, if they're dropping off on snow, they don't survive very well. So places that have a longer winter ticks struggle. Places that have a short winter ticks do well. So in far northern Maine, even though they have a ton of moose, they have lower impacts from winter ticks because their winters are longer. So we're kind of, northeastern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, and western Maine are kind of the only area where it's far enough south that winters are short enough, but you still have enough moose to where you really see this impact. So like we are the only part of the world that sees this ridiculous amount of winter tick impact because of that combination of moose densities and the length of winter. So yes, if winters were longer, that's the climate change side of it. If winters were longer, winter ticks probably wouldn't be a problem. And as our winters get shorter, they're going to get worse. Or that threshold's going to change.
As far as when you're like tracking the moose, as far as like them crossing borders to surrounding states, do you guys all communicate, or how does that work?
Yeah. So the wildlife field in general, but particularly the moose field. I mean, I'm the moose biologist for Vermont. New Hampshire has a moose biologist. Maine has a moose biologist. We're all very close. Like we're all good friends. So like we talk all the time. Yeah. We actually have an annual meeting of us, and then we let other states that don't have moose, New York and Massachusetts and Quebec and New Brunswick come. We all have an annual meeting every year. We just got together in August. So yeah, we talk about this stuff. It's a small world, so we're all good friends. And yeah, we definitely had moose. Oddly, our moose rarely ever went into Canada. They went into New Hampshire occasionally. We had one of our collared moose that went all the way to Gray, Maine. So if anyone understands the map, that's about 100 miles southeast from our study area. Yeah. Any?
What was your master's?
My master's was, so master's degrees are a little weird because often at least in like the wildlife management field, it's more about what your thesis is than the title of your degree. So my degree is natural resources wildlife from the University of New Hampshire. But really it's the thesis, which was my thesis was on white-tailed deer. And that's kind of what helps you, your thesis is what helps you get the job following grad school often.
Do you think lowering the moose population in order to decrease the tick population, and then you try and rebuild the moose population again, that they'll be healthy enough to reproduce even when the two other factors, like brain?
So in the northeast corner of the state, I think moose will be plenty healthy if we can get ticks under control. There's lots of habitat. I think they'll be fine. And they're anyone who hunt. I mean, I happen to deer hunt in that part of the state. There aren't very many deer. In most of Vermont, I don't think. My guess would be we're probably not going to see any more moose than we currently have for the foreseeable future, unless we see some big change in habitat, meaning a lot more young forest habitat. I don't think in most of Vermont we're going to see more moose, no matter what we do to try to manage it. So. That's why we're trying to focus only on the place we think they can get healthier, which is the northeast corner.
Just out of curiosity, with the brainworm, I'd heard through a couple of friends that sometimes moose, there are actually worms that build up in their heart. Is that the same worm that does that? Is it different?
No, so there's a laundry list of parasites that any wild animal, if you knew how many parasites wild animals carry, you would never touch one. So moose have several different tapeworms that they will they are an intermediate host for tapeworms. They're dog tapeworms. So we always recommend people never feed raw moose meat to if they have a dog, because you will give it tapeworm. But they have lungworms. They have all sorts of roundworm thing. I mean, yeah, it's a whole list of things. Lungworms are probably the one that people would see if they actually like cut into the trachea. Sometimes they'll get in other places, or especially if you kill a moose, because then they're coughing things all over the place. But that's probably what like a hunter would notice if they opened up a moose, would be the lungworms. Because it's like, in a bad infection, it's like spaghetti almost when you open it up. It's gross. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you have to have a iron gut to do that sort of work. No gag reflex. Cool. Any other questions? Great. Well, thanks.
Thank you very much.